lost livelihoods, has actually encouraged the whole issue to be elevated into proper policy agenda, and also, of course, to be understood a lot more by households. And very crucial to that had been Nick Stern's analysis. Nick, now Lord Stern, for whom I worked in government for a while, he suggested in his climate change review that there would be an enormous potential loss in world GDP caused by climate change, and that could range from 5% to 20% each year. And he recommended that the world should spend 1% of global GDP per annum to avoid the worst outcome, and 2% of GDP per annum if we wanted to ensure temperatures stabilize at an acceptable level. The problem, of course, is that in order to act, we need to be convinced that this is serious enough for us to do so. And we tend, on our day-to-day lives, discount the future in preference for utility now. And of course, Stern and his team recognize this, and controversially, they argued that we should be treating the welfare of all generations, whether they're current and future generations, more or less equally. So he suggested a social time preference discount rate of just 0.1%, though an overall discount rate of 1.4% was employed in the work that we all did. That compares, of course, with UK public policy's long-term discount rate for public investment, which is set at 3.5%. So quite a difference. What it really meant, of course, this change, this lowering of the discount rate, was that we did need and we did value acting early much more on the basis of the calculations we made than would otherwise have been the case. It was quite controversial then, I have to admit. I remember quite a lot of academics standing up and saying that that was sort of quite wrong. But what it did is it did capture to a considerable extent the feeling that was there at the time, because something needed to happen and some action needed to take place. It moved the discussion and the understanding that the cost of not acting now would be much greater in the future. And of course, it had to counter also the arguments that, yes, the population will be richer in the future, but can't they do this later themselves rather than us becoming impoverished while we're tackling with this at present? But the truth is that it might be too late, and the cost, in fact, would be too great even then. So that's how the whole discussion moved at the time. And it's, I think, now perfectly understood that the cost of not acting now will be much greater in the future. So that's how the Stern review was developed and taken up. And now, of course, Nick Stern is an advisor on everything that's happening right now. The truth, though, is that confusion still reigns. The reality is that though we agree that we need to be looking at a slightly different discount rate, there isn't really a technically correct intergenerational discount rate that we can use. And it's really axiomatic that economic policy making cannot be a value-free science. That's now accepted that this is the case. And economics has been very crucial in bringing the issue, because of arguing it along the lines that I discussed, to the attention of politicians and elevating, of course, as I was suggesting, the need to act now among the public. So moral considerations come in, as this discount rate cannot be value-free, and that has to be accepted. So what we needed was a compromise to square the circle. So the Green Book, which, as I said, still uses the discount rate of 3.5%, that's the book that's used by the Treasury to decide on when it appraises investments for the future and looks at the cost benefit. So it's now used for the first 30 years. But thereafter is supplemented with a lower and declining discount rate. So that allows greater emphasis on the welfare of future generations. So at least we have achieved something that way. But of course, it also suggests that there is an imperative to properly price in externalities and correct market failures, hence the suggestions for a carbon tax, certainly higher carbon tax than we've got now, and also regulation to ensure the right behavior is also encouraged. And the truth is also, unfortunately, that externalities in relation to environmental degradation more generally are not captured by the standard measures of GDP. So they ignore the nature and depreciation of natural assets. GDP can't really capture that at present. So we have to adjust the finance that is made available to these longer term risks and incorporate also nature to a much greater extent in decision systems. So again, economics has contributed very significantly to this by moving the discussion forward. And that has been the basis of quite a lot of the decisions that can be made. Two final points. A lot of emphasis is being put right now on behavioral change as well. As I said, the understanding that something needs to happen now, is spread among the generation, particularly the young. But it is important to alter, for example, household behavior in terms of whatever is emitted in terms of CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions from households themselves. And that can be very significant. We can change the way in which people behave. But really what behavioral science is telling us is that in terms of climate change policy, normal monetary incentives that you can think of, such as, for example, it's going to be cheaper for you to have a replacement of your standard gas boiler, and therefore you should be doing it. They do not work in isolation. So lower household bills might be an inducement to some people, but not more generally, because you need to achieve a huge scale change in behavior. And to achieve that type of change, you need widespread education, a lot of explanation providing the evidence of the scale of the threat so that people understand it and therefore get the motivation for action to be there. And this, of course, needs to be supplemented by outlining additionally the benefits that will accrue to everyone, from not just your individual lower cost possibly, but social health and general well-being from changed energy use. And I think with COVID and the experience that we have just had, that is perhaps slightly easier to do. But at the end of the day, as some economists are suggesting, you can get all those changes to happen. As we know, through the first year of the pandemic, we had quite a reduction in carbon emissions. And if we carried on like that, and we had the same reduction, that would be great. We'll achieve our 1.5 centigrade increase and keep it at that over the period we're looking at. But it isn't happening to any considerable extent for the longer term. We're still seeing an increase now in carbon emissions and oil demand, quite a substantial one. So it is perhaps, at the end of the day, technological innovation that is going to be the key. Not only can it solve some of the problems, if we're thinking of new technologies that can come up, and we need a lot of cooperation across governments to achieve this, but we also are able, possibly in the longer term, to produce a lot of the energy that we need a lot more cheaply, which is the case with renewables already, and therefore, in fact, see that we don't lose on a yearly basis, but actually, at the end of the day, we win.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Vicky. Really well said. Very interesting about behavioural implications. So I'd like to move on now to introduce Jonathan Porritt, Founder Director of Forum for the Future, Chancellor of Keele University, and awarded a CBE in January 2000 for services to environmental protection. Your latest book, Hope in Hell, A Decade to Confront the Climate Emergency, was published by Simon & Schuster last year. So Jonathan, you're very welcome. Look forward to hearing your thoughts on the green economy in the context of current capitalist models.
Thanks, Beverley. And thanks, Vicky. Good to hear those two reminders that we've certainly seen a massive ramping up of economic commitments around a low carbon economy for the future. And we have, I guess, now got an ambition level that we've never witnessed before. And Vicky ended her talk by saying that maybe we're going to be completely dependent on green technology to deliver what we need to deliver. To a certain extent, that has been the prevailing view of many people in the green movement for the last 30 years. And there has in effect been what I call a unspoken concordat amongst people, which is that rather than look at some of the structural incompatibilities between a genuinely sustainable and just economy and our current economic models, we won't go there. What we'll do is to talk about using dominant economic models, GDP-based, profit-based, growth-based, to optimize the economy as it exists today, but not to transform it. And essentially the whole Stern story, it's all about optimization. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's what has allowed the debate to become richer gradually during the course of that time, not necessarily to land very much during the course of that time, but nonetheless to get richer. What it's permitted the Green Movement to do, of course, is to avoid much more complex, angular, controversial discussions about compatibility between a sustainable economy and profit-driven economic growth, to avoid discussions about population growth altogether, which remain deeply controversial and people just don't want to go there, and to a certain extent, to avoid discussion about the compatibility between a sustainable economy and capitalism as we understand it today. Part of that thinking is that the time is never right to do those deeper investigations. And you can absolutely understand that, and you can see it now. And I have to admit to being party to that. In Hope in Hell, I've acknowledged that right now, this is not a brilliant time to have a deep discussion about post-growth economics. I'm avoiding the use of the phrase no growth or degrowth economics, but just go with post-growth, which is slightly less threatening to all those people who don't imagine that we can have human life on Earth without growth. I acknowledge that right now, were you to leap into a really deep debate about post-growth, it probably wouldn't play well, and there would be mighty little support across any part of the political spectrum whatsoever. And that's because in a COVID recovery period, it's really very difficult to think about how you would make those arguments work. So in effect, we're kind of stuck in a green growth paradigm. That's really what Vicky was ending on, this notion that we need to optimize our model of growth and we need to make it green, not sustainable, but we need to make it green. And we will do that through a number of different things, but many of which depend on an issue that Vicky referred to, which is cost internalization. So that the massive, overwhelming economic externalities of our current growth model will be addressed via progressive cost internalization. That also allows us to think that we can go on negotiating with capital, with multinational capital in the way that we do now. We can go on optimizing that model of multinational intervention in the world. We can somehow stick to a model of corporate sustainability that we've had since the Earth Summit in 1992, and all will be well. And investors can get really excited about ESG investments, particularly if you go with the kind of model advanced by Larry Fink and BlackRock. If you think about where we are now, where evidence from the natural world is accelerating at every turn, and the proportionality of the response from the human world, from our political systems, is clearly nowhere near the speed of change going on in the natural world, then that whole notion about green growth needs to be re-examined. Some of the things that underlie it, that it'll be in our interest to do this. It'll generate new jobs, new skills, particularly for young people. It'll open up whole new areas of economic development and prosperity that we haven't had access to before. It'll reduce inefficiencies in the system because we'll just get better at manufacturing, make it leaner and greener. We'll do all this cost internalization stuff, and hey presto, markets will work better because costs and prices will be more accurately aligned. Now, if you look back over the last 30 years and analyze the degree to which any of that has actually worked by way of improved outcomes on the ground for people or planet, let alone for future generations, and the discount rate discussion is, after all about that, you'd have to say the progress during those 30 years has been extremely limited. Extremely limited. On cost internalization, for one thing. So now we are going to have to open up the discussion differently, and that's what I tried to address in my chapter in the book. We're going to have to think about different capitalist models and the degree to which we need to confront existing incumbency interests who ensure that we never get to have the kind of discussion we really need about transforming capitalism rather than seeking increasingly forlornly to optimize this model of capitalism. And that story of incumbency, this is my last comment, Beverley, is really difficult because we now have a double incumbency problem. We have legacy incumbents, which go right back to the post-war growth period, and particularly to the heart of the fossil fuel empire. And now we have what I call the neo-incumbents, all of those people who've got fantastically rich. Don't forget, we now share this world with 2,000 billionaires, neo-incumbents, many of whom have only made that kind of level of astonishing wealth since over the last 10 to 15 years. And we don't have much political analysis when it comes to thinking what we're going to do about that. So simply relying on models of new technology and green growth, I think just means we're in for another 30 years of pretty rich disappointment.
Well, thank you. Slightly gloomy note to finish on, but certainly very provocative, and I look forward to hearing comments in response. Our next speaker is, I'm very pleased to welcome Hopi Sen, who's joining us for WMG and is a co-author in a chapter which Margot James, former MP for Stourbridge, wrote and co-authored along with Vanessa Goodship, who's also here as well. Very welcome, Vanessa, from WMG. But Hopi has been a research fellow at WMG after some time, 20 years or so, I believe, Hopi, as working in communications, running campaigns for the Labour Party. Hopi, prior to that, actually, I noticed that you enjoyed a lucrative career in advertising. So communications is your forte. Looking forward to hearing your thoughts now for the next few minutes. And thanks so much, Hopi.
Thank you. And as you can probably tell from that background, I should start by thanking my incredible co-authors, Margot and Vanessa, who you can tell from our relative levels of expertise did the lion's share of work on the articles while I get to show off in front of the audience. The starting point for our chapter was that digital technology has enormous potential as an enabler of sustainable production, consumption and recycling. And as such, perhaps then we're part of the silent concordat that Jonathan spoke about earlier. But as technicians, I think we're relatively comfortable with that mission-focused goal and seeing how far we can get with that. And there is potential here. For example, by using digital twins, we can optimize the design of wind turbines for specific sites, improving efficiency, optimizing operations, and according to one recent study, increasing the energy production of a wind farm by up to 20%. In the steel industry, we can deploy sensors to achieve greater control over production, reducing the energy demand of an energy-intensive process and reducing the waste byproducts from steelmaking. At the consumer level, smart meters in households can prompt people to change their home energy demands. As Vicky mentioned earlier, that's something that needs to be combined with explaining the reason that people should make a switch. And the scale of the potential there is limited, but it is still very significant. According to the IEA, smart demand responses alone could offer 185 gigawatts of savings globally. In transport, connected and autonomous mobility offers the potential to reduce congestion and therefore emissions, to better integrate public and private transport, and to improve the utility and service life of vehicles. And digitization can also support recycling and reuse. At WMG, we've modeled that the UK will require over 500,000 tons of battery cell production by 2040. That will require 131,000 tons of cathodic metals, which obviously has huge sustainability consequences. Recycling can potentially supply a fifth of this. And by deploying sensors within battery cells to transmit information on battery status, we can enhance the market for second-hand batteries by verifying the health of the battery and showing what uses it is best suited for. So those are the kind of practical opportunities that digitization offers. However, there are also challenges, and it's important to not fall into a kind of tech utopianism here. Jonathan's message earlier is very well taken on the issues of that overall approach. However, even at the technical, practical level, there are real challenges to address. We're all aware of the abundance of digital devices and data. There are considerable carbon emissions associated with both hardware and software. In 2017, which is well before the current boom in e-devices, the UK saw an average e-waste per person of 13.2 kilograms. We must also focus on reducing consumption and improving lifetime use and recycling if we're going to change any of that. Just as in batteries, the deployment of sensors in finished goods can track the fate of electronic devices, supporting efforts to ensure recycling and reuse. And as digital goods get more complex and more compact, recycling them becomes ever more challenging. So for example, we can use robotics to disassemble televisions, improving both the amount of material recovered and the value of the recovered materials. And while events like ours today show the potential of digital tech to reduce carbon emissions by reducing the need to travel, the management of data itself causes emissions. As a guide, data centers used 1% of global electricity output in 2018. So there needs to be complete sustainability in all aspects of digitalization, from networks, data storage to software platforms. A switch to an entirely renewable energy source is one solution. A more creative solution is to consider how to use the heat servers generate rather than just simply cool them. The potential for all this is real, but limited. The Made Smarter review found that the adoption of digitalization technologies could reduce carbon dioxide emissions in manufacturing alone by 4.5% without sacrificing any economic growth. So how do we deliver this? First, we need a green digital infrastructure powered by renewable energy sources. Second, manufacturing industries must embrace green digitalization and design for extending life, second use and recycling. Third, policies must incentivize green digitization, whether this is supporting the development of smart industrial processes to reduce energy uses or mandating the manufacture of low energy consuming and easily recycled products. Government has a key role to play. Finally, there's a need for a rapidly developing and flexible range of net zero skills to train the next generation of data-driven digital innovators in everything from reducing complexity to design for reuse. Each of these steps requires a partnership between industry and research and skills providers, often at the firm level. And there's therefore a clear need for a clear national strategy for deploying digital technology to support the greening of our economy. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Yes, you got a lot in there, Hopi, and it's a very full chapter. So thanks very much indeed for that. And I will move over to our next panelist, Jack Dromey, MP for Birmingham Erdington, well known, I'm sure, to our audience here today, and known to me as Vice Chair of the APPG for Manufacturing, which has just produced an excellent report. And Jack, I was really thrilled to be able to contribute to that as one of the commissioners. Jack, would you like to talk a little bit? Thank you for your afterword to the book. I know this is a subject very close to your heart, but if you would like to give us a few words about perhaps greening the economy in the context of the West Midlands, that would be tremendous. Jack, you're muted.
There we are.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not that anyone on this call needs convincing, but if ever there was an argument for a sense of urgency, it is the emerging evidence, yet to be confirmed as I understand it, but the emerging evidence that the Amazon is now emitting more CO2 than it has been absorbing for the first time. And that should profoundly worry us in terms of the direction of travel as to the nature of our planet. What I want to do is to focus, as you've said, on the West Midlands, because ahead of COP26 for the West Midlands, the prime focus will be on green manufacturing. And the West Midlands led the first industrial revolution, the birth of the City of the Thousand Trades here in Birmingham. The West Midlands tackled what was deep-seated problems in terms of transition, and now going forward at the next stages, the role of manufacturing and transition will be absolutely key. And that means for me, making the West Midlands the capital of green manufacturing for the future. And that means, I stress again, supporting the process of transition from the internal combustion to new technologies of EV, including, of course, hydrogen. Now, what we need going forward at the next stages is an ambition of approach. To that end, I think the role of Parliament will be key in holding government to account and building cross-party alliances, because there is support across Parliament for ambition in tackling climate change and transition. To that end, or the work that we will be doing, the APPG for the environment, likewise, will be very important indeed. It's crucial that we do that in terms of the process of transition, but also because the last thing we need is to fall behind continental competitors who are being much more ambitious in terms of their investments. So, for example, France and Germany. the example I would take is that whilst I warmly welcome the proposal for the Nissan £1 billion gigafactory in the northeast, we need at least 7 gigafactories. And I don't want to see our automotive industry going through a difficult period of transition, face difficulties in terms of not having the technology available to it in this country. Crucial also will be supply chains. And there's a welcome debate going on now around resilience as a consequence of the crisis we've been living through over the last year and two. And how do we bring back supply chain manufacture and provision to this country? And that's a very welcome move, because it obviously makes sense for the car companies, some of whom have really had problems in terms of having to rely upon unreliable supply chains, but also it creates jobs and capacity in this country. And it means that we do not have elongated supply chains worldwide, with all the impact that that has in terms on the global environment. To that end, I mean, right now I'm fighting a battle in relation to the future of the GKN plant in my own constituency, where we deployed a very sophisticated argument, is that rather than closure and the work transferring to Poland and France, that it should become the groundbreaking EV tech supplier of key products for the automotive industry at the next stages. Can I just make 2 final points? Forgive me, by the way, if I'm being a bit croaky, because I've not been well. Can I just make two final points? Is that a wider point about the importance of this debate is we've been focusing predominantly on the economics, and in my case, what I strongly believe in relation to West Midlands manufacturing and the potential arising out of transition. But there's also the argument about people's lives, health and well-being. And I have been from the start a strong supporter of the proposal from Birmingham City Council for a clean air zone. It's been deeply controversial in Birmingham, deeply controversial. And my very strong view is that politicians need to give political leadership about the issue of health, well-being, pollution, and the dreadful impact that it has. The final point then that I would make is that I came through the trade union movement, as people on this call will know, and historically there was a fear of the impact of technological change. What would it lead to? My very strong view is that this is not just an economic imperative, not just a moral imperative, but actually properly managed and engaging workers and their trade unions. This is something which is very good news for working people.
Sorry, Jack, that you haven't been so well, and thank you very much for closing on such a positive note. Right, now over to my colleague, Steve McCabe, Dr. McCabe, who works with me at the Ideas Institute at Birmingham City University and is a long-standing academic who's written a great deal, contributed to many books and co-edited 3 with bite-sized books over the last couple of years, including, of course, the one we're launching today. Steve, over to you.
Okay, I'm going to share the screen if that's okay. Okay, Beverley? Oh, right, you're muted, okay.
yes, fine. Please go ahead. I've allowed access.
Right, okay. Okay, I'm conscious of the fact that I don't want this to be a sort of death by PowerPoint. If I could get the, that's better. Okay, so I'm going to quickly whiz through this. I'm very conscious of the fact that I mean, a number of points have come up already. We're aware, I suspect I'm talking to the converted, that we do have a crisis, but I'm also conscious that a fair number of people don't believe that we're in a crisis. But you know, that is as it may be, and we have to sort of continue regardless. I'd also like to draw attention to a sort of really great book written by James Allman about 5 or 6 years ago, Stuffification, Living More with Less. And in that sense, what I'm going to sort of look at is the sort of the way that we can all act greener by using less of the sort of the stuff that we consume. Okay, first slide, which is, it's the obvious, the Industrial Revolution has been a good thing, but of course what we know is it produces an awful lot of waste which goes up into the atmosphere, and the whole climate change agenda has been sort of dealt with by others, but of course the fact is we can see the rise in the Earth's temperature, and in fact the last 40 years it's gone up pretty sort of dramatically, and we see the sort of consequence of that in the regular headlines. But of course that's not what I'm interested in. It's the fact that as advanced societies, we produce an awful lot of waste, phenomenal. And of course, we're all aware, if we live in urban environments, we have to create dumps, as it were, or burn this, or do something with it. Or as we've been doing in recent years, and many countries now are saying no more, sending the waste that we don't want to deal with elsewhere to deal with it. And I'll touch on recycling in a couple of moments. Of course, yes, seasides, we're aware that flotsam wash up on the beach, but we see this regularly, and communities in other parts of the world are blighted by the rubbish that we throw away. And indeed, of course, if you live around here, you see this as a regular sight. We consume more and more stuff, as it's called, and it's phenomenal the size of boxes that all this comes. It has to be manufactured in the first place, and then it has to be disposed of, and we hope recycled, in order to put it back into the system. I won't dwell on this. You can see here, it's actually quite surprising. The biggest contributor is construction, and actually it's very strange. Coincidentally, there's we've had a couple of house moves very recently, and the first thing that people do is they get the skips and start renovating, and of course that's perfectly fine. Where does that waste go to, and how much that can actually be put back into the system? But of course we're talking millions of tons, and of course as you appreciate, the data is a little bit outdated, so it could be outdated. It could be worse than that, although we hope, of course, people, as they strive to improve themselves, are working on reducing that. Is there an alternative? Well, of course there is. What we operate now is the so-called linear economy, the take, make and dispose. And what we should be getting into is a make, use and recycle. And that is the basis of the circular economy. So of course a simplistic overview, but it's restorative or regenerative by intention design. So you start from that principle. And the idea, of course, is that we make these things so we can put them back into the system, and it's not a case of built-in obsolescence, as used to be the case, but make do and mend, as the expression used to be used during the war, when, of course, we were faced with crisis, using more renewable energy. And of course, if we make less stuff, as it were, then of course we need less energy, and of course energy is the problem that's causing climate change, as we believe. Eliminating toxic chemicals, because that's part of the problem of recycling, getting rid of that. Quite often paper with a shiny surface can't be recycled, and of course the thing is, though, vastly reducing the amount of waste. So of course what we end up is a much more virtual circle, which of course is less harmful to the environment. Of course, what we've got to try and do, as Jonathan was picking up, and is indeed picked up by Tony Juniper in one of the chapters in the book, is producing a better environment, because that's good for us all. And I know one of the questions come through, this comes from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, who've done a lot of work in it, and I'll just leave that for you to look at and not go through them and bore you with the details. But of course, some fairly significant savings are indeed possible for all of us. So we all collectively benefit if we start to develop a much more circular economy than has been the case hitherto. Okay, I'm really conscious of time. I'd like to get into the questions. The data on recycling is interesting. You can see there, if you look down the right, the key. Some of the recycling is really good. The green being the electrical components, that's good, as is glass. What's actually very worrying is if I can use the cursor here, textiles. We buy an awful lot of clothes, and anybody who's ever been into the city centres will know. The clothes shops, they are part of the consumer boom, but of course we tend to buy them and throw them away. It's part of the disposable society. Okay, I'm going to quickly draw this to a close. There is some progress we see here now, that goods will have the right to be repaired, which of course is no bad thing, that we buy something and get it fixed, rather than having a new replacement sent out and then having to deal with the old products, which of course go to the tip or wherever. Again, I draw the attention to the fact that we can, as certainly my childhood grew up in the sort of 1960s and 70s, we used to buy things in bags and jars and sort of, so there are some really good examples. And what I'd like to do actually is to give a plug to a couple of sort of local sort of exemplars, and some of you may be aware if you live in Birmingham, the Clean Kilo, who spoke at a conference I was at a couple of years ago, and that was very impressive. And Off the Scale, which opened about a year or so in King's Heath, and that's actually Eddie O'Callaghan. I went to school with him, but of course that's recycling clothes. So all things are possible, but of course what it comes from is we as consumers have to demand more, and we have to sort of demand a higher standard from sort of the people that supply to us. And of course, as I mentioned or alluded to, we've done it all before, but that, of course, that was a proper crisis. Well, this is an even bigger one. Perhaps we just don't realize it yet. And of course, a shameless plug for the book. So of course, I would urge you to go out and buy the book, because of course, there's some really great chapters in there, including those written by Beverley, myself, and some of the contributors today. Okay.
Thanks very much. That's great, Steve. Really, really good of that. And I think you you did.
Oh, I need to stop sharing.
Yeah. Could you stop sharing? Thanks so much, Steve. And
hang on. How do I?
Yeah. Okay, so I thought you raised a good point about how, what can we all do? It's a huge topic. Everybody has made that clear. Are you managing to close that, Steve?
Is that gone?
No, it hasn't.
Yeah, I've got it. Okay.
Okay. Oh, that's brilliant. Right. Okay. But one thing I just wondered if we could perhaps address to Jonathan is what about timescales here? Is the next 10 years vital or not, in your view, Jonathan?
It certainly is. You don't need to rely on me for that guidance. The clarity of the scientific advice now is honestly so crystal clear that the fact there are still people out there, Steve, who are saying this is not a crisis, well, God help them. Honestly, yes. It's just an unbelievable situation we find ourselves in. So we have to halve emissions in 10 years. That's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change advice, halve emissions in 10 years, so that we've got a chance then of building through to the ultra low carbon economy we need by 2050. So the only thing I just want to say is that had we used the last 30 years more constructively, we would be really good at things like low carbon living, the circular economy and so on, but we've frittered away those 30 years. So we're still actually talking about these things as if it was a massive, massive breakthrough to begin to get better at recycling and stuff like this. I'm trying not to be gloomy, Beverley, but I'm also trying to inject a note of reality, because this is a very circular set of ideas that we sometimes fall prey to, and we're going to have to engineer some pretty dramatic breakthroughs to get people to understand the true nature of the crisis.
Yes.
Can I come in, Beverley?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Vicky.
Because, of course, I mean, Jonathan is right that if things had been done and if the economics had been listened to from when the original report was done in the mid-2000s, we wouldn't be in the position we're in now. And indeed, we will need now to spend an awful lot more than perhaps we had anticipated before. So for the UK, we're talking about 50 billion a year, and between now and 2030, if we are to get any close to achieving the targets we want to achieve. So the next 10 years are absolutely essential. Because in Europe, I mean, Christine Lagarde has made this big impassioned speech about needing to develop a green common market, if you like, or a green common capital market in the EU. Because of course, one will need to raise the money somehow. They're anticipating that they will need 330 billion of spent every year between now and 2030. So we are really talking about it's coming up on the agenda, yes, but that money needs to be spent. Now, Jonathan may think that this isn't really going to be the issue necessarily if we're going to be, if we think that we're just going to have lots of renewables to make up for it. That may not do it by itself. And of course, you will need behavioral change and other ways of looking at what we do. But that money still needs to be found somehow. And it wouldn't have been anything like as high if we had started earlier, obviously.
Thank you very much, Vicky. Well, one of the things that I think people also wonder is there a role for the green economy in terms of levelling up? We hear a lot about levelling up and regional inequality at the moment. One of our chapters, co-written by Lisa Trickett and Brian Knott, looks at this. And Brian, I don't know, Brian, are you on the call? I'm sorry, there's 3 pages and I'm unable to see everybody at the moment. But Brian, if you're there, would you like to say a brief word on that?
Yeah, thanks, Beverley. And I think it is an important issue. It sort of picks up on Jack's point of air zones that have become such a divisive issue, and everything that Jonathan was talking about. But we are concerned that if we're going to do this, we're going to have to do it with consent. That it's going to need broad consent across the public. And when you see those sort of issues becoming wedge issues, it does make you concerned as to how we're going to be able to make the really significant changes that we need to make. And I think on issues such as levelling up, there is the potential there that it could be used as a sort of a real driver of greening the economy. But the government's sort of record on this isn't great. The Office for National Statistics has sort of said that in the 5 years leading up to the pandemic, there's actually been 30,000 fewer green jobs in the economy over that period of time. So there's a lot of policy that needs to change, and the whole approach that needs to change. Because I think if we don't get communities who at the moment don't see the environment as being their priority to appreciate what can be achieved through greening the economy, it will simply become one of those issues that becomes a wedge issue, and it won't allow us to make the progress that we need to make. And so even issues such as the universal credit cuts that have been announced, that's going to put more pressure on people. 4% of people who receive universal credit are in work, and rebalancing our society and our economy is a sort of a vital component to achieving the action that we need on climate change.
Thanks so much for that, Brian. And a question in the chat, how do we establish this agenda in terms of education of young people? And Jonathan, as Chancellor of Keele University, might look to you for a comment on that again.
There's a lot going on in this space, happily, and I expect that we will see very significant changes from both a higher and further education point of view, and from the secondary school curriculum point of view. One of the things that will pick up in pace before Glasgow conference, COP26, is to emphasize the importance of education and really to push those buttons very hard indeed. So I'm confident that that will improve. It's one of the areas where I think we can be more hopeful. And if we aren't going to press those buttons, rest assured young people will press those buttons for us. One of my great reasons to be hopeful is the growing eloquence and anger of young people who frankly are just totally pissed off with us lot and how appalling the situation is that we've left them in.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I can see a lot of nodding heads there, actually, so clearly heartfelt. One of the other questions that I can see in chat at the moment, and please do add your questions, is how can we convince manufacturers and especially SMEs to invest? And I'd really like to address that to another of our contributors, David Seal, who is also a professor at University of Surrey, if I've remembered correctly. I hope so. Yeah.
Thanks, Beverley. I was actually thinking about the same thing as you were going to ask me the question. I think it's a very challenging situation at the moment. Just looking at simple measures like the cost of industrial gas supply versus electricity, with it being about a quarter of the cost per unit of electricity, is a massive disincentive to invest in sustainably produced electricity at the moment. And I find it very difficult. There's got to be some sort of fiscal intervention here from the Treasury to drive the right behaviours, because being a non-executive in a small manufacturing company, I put these things to the board about how we're going to change some of the things we're going to do, how we're going to improve our whole sort of ESG performance as a business, and at the end it comes down to capital expenditure and running costs, and can we sustain these things? We want to do the right things, but the current system pushes us against doing the right things.
No, thank you very much. I'm trying to get through these questions here in chat, and please do keep adding them. There's a question from Robin Stafford about the glacial pace of progress in the UK, and the fact that we've only got one Green MP, Caroline Lucas, but how can we accelerate dramatically progress, asks Harold. Robin, and so I think he's really addressing this again to you, Jonathan.
Oh, indeed, to Jack, because I think one of the issues that we face is that this is not a shared level of urgency across the entire political spectrum, as we know. And it's not that the Lib Dems and Labour aren't doing good stuff about this, they are, but it really is a question of ramping it up in a very different way. I won't bore everybody today with the importance of electoral reform and proportional representation, that I'm sure you all do understand that, because then we'd probably end up with a greener spectrum of views in the Commons. But I know Jack's been pretty focused on this as well for many a long year.
Thank you. Jack, do you want to add a few words?
Sure. My apologies. Well, two things. The first is my whole experience, I spent, like Jonathan, like yours and many on this call, is that fundamental change follows the development of a movement of political and social pressure. And I totally agree with the point that has been made about the extent to which young people are energized about this agenda. If I was to express a concern, is that going forward for a successful outcome from COP, what we need is for that to be mobilized more effectively than it's been thus far. MPs need to be getting their ears burnt in constituencies all over the country. Bringing alive both the scale of the problem, but the scale of the potential as well. And secondly, I think then in Parliament, it's what we do, Jonathan, including there's some really quite good cross-party working. If I was, in all honesty, I wouldn't want to overstate that, but that all-party working has been really quite good, and it's developing. And the final point I'd make is that, and I don't make this as a gratuitously party political point, but this is about, does the government means what it says? If you look at the rhetoric around COP26, you think the world will change. The reality is far less convincing at this stage. So I think it's about a mass movement, it's about organization, it's about what we do in Parliament, but a whole range of voices speaking out and contributing towards the fundamental transformation of our planet's fortunes. And I think the book, dare I say, just to take this opportunity, Beverley and Steve, is an absolutely outstanding contribution to that.
No, thank you so much.
Could I add a more optimistic note to this? 1 second, because I know Robin Stafford quite well, and he's absolutely right. But of course, we're focusing the discussion here very much on the UK, although Jonathan has looked more widely at some of that. And of course, there's COP26 coming up. I mean, we're still in a position where, China's, has, yes, done a lot on renewables, but still using an awful lot of gas, for example, and coal. So even the small changes that we might make in terms of how we use our roads or anything else probably aren't going to be that significant. But the way in which the renewables have now captured a much bigger share of overall electricity generation or power generation generally is pretty good news. But of course, it has happened because of those incentives that have been given, basically huge subsidization of solar and wind, which, without that subsidization, the increase that we have seen wouldn't have happened. So there is a role for government, obviously, in terms of encouraging that. But I was just thinking about the challenge that was mentioned from manufacturing on how to incentivize moving into different type of production. And I fear, although there are capital allowances and everything else you can perhaps use right now, the government has put in place temporarily, that we are going to see increases in prices happening with the carbon price going up, the EU itself instituting possibly this border adjustment mechanism, so it actually charges for carbon emissions imported into the EU. All that is going to be an extra cost. Now you can incentivize by making production processes more costly, but that has definitely an implication on cost of the economy over certainly the shorter term.
Thank you very much. One of the points that's been made in the chat is about the community and involving the community. I've just spotted Matthew Rhodes, and Matthew is another contributor to the book as chair of Energy Capital, West Midlands Energy Capital. Matthew, I wondered if you wanted to sort of comment in the context of energy about community engagement.
Yeah, I think listening to the conversation that there's some big challenges there, as everywhere else. Communities are vital for green energy economy because the behaviours of people are very, very important, and also because a lot of the energy technology is very local. And I think there's a tension then between that need to drive local change and the kind of global picture Jonathan was painting earlier, where you're trying to get everyone to think as a we for the whole of the human race, basically. So at one level, we're trying to inspire communities here to take the initiative, to take responsibility, to do new things locally that they're not used to doing, particularly in the UK, and possibly to compete with each other, which is the kind of capitalist motivation. And at the same time, you're trying to get them to think holistically. And I think we've got a long way to go to get that right.
Thanks very much, Matthew, for that contribution. Another one of our contributors to the book, Tor Farquhar, is here, former HR director at a steel, one of the big steel companies. Tor, do you want to talk a little bit about manufacturing and how we can drive the contribution there?
Yeah, I think linking sort of some of the comments together, Jonathan and Steve talking about consumption and production and the kind of UK versus global piece here. It is that consumption aspect that is the key to unlocking those two aspects. And steel is a good example of it. We consume a lot more steel in the UK than we produce. For various reasons, we're not particularly good at stewarding asset-intensive, long lead businesses. But actually, if we tax consumption of steel, and that's the responsible thing to do, because ultimately, as we're talking about local waste or whatever, it is what we consume that affects the planet rather than what we produce. So it's quite easy for us to take a quite, high moral stance on what we produce, but actually offshore emissions, sort of carbon colonialism would be how I kind of describe it. And the mature economies of the world need to really watch that, because you can greenwash your achievements, but actually be emitting more carbon as a result. So I think that focus on consumption, both locally and globally, actually starts to address that balance. And you start to say, if countries are responsible for the emissions on their consumption, then they need to work more globally with production in China or India or wherever it's coming from, as well as the UK, to say we need to reduce emissions overall. So I think somewhere in there, I'm not as smart as most of the academics on this call, but I think I throw the challenge to smarter minds on the call in terms of how do we solve that issue. But it has the effect of both reducing global emissions and protecting manufacturing and high technology roles globally and in the UK and Europe. And I think we need to find a combination that does both to get the kind of support from communities that we all need for this agenda.
Thanks so much for that, Tor, because you raise an interesting point about the outsourced carbon emissions. And, it's sometimes said, well, as the UK, we're only 1% of global emissions. But of course, if you take into account our supply chain emissions and what we're effectively exporting, it must be a great deal more. And Vicky, as an economist, I wondered if you know of any data around that at all.
No, but I mentioned that this is something that the EU is intending to put into place.
Yes.
And of course, it's now discussing it also with the US. So I mean, you just need to look at how much manufacturing is done elsewhere and how much of our production process is dependent on the supply chains which come from elsewhere, certainly outside the EU as well, to note that actually if we were to be properly taxing it or putting a tariff or a carbon tax on it, it would hugely increase the cost of production here. But yes, of course, you can distinguish between production and consumption, if you like. But we're consuming steel for the production process. So who pays? Is it the company that uses that steel? And the interesting thing about steel itself is that we've gone back. Steel production is something like record highs right now across the world. And of course, using huge amounts of energy. And it's happening right now as we're here debating those concerns. But it would actually make a very, very big difference if we were charging for those offshoring of emissions to our manufacturing process, and at the end of the day, to the consumer.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Vicky. And one of the recommendations from our APPG report on manufacturing was to bring forward the date for standards and labelling on embedded carbon emissions in products produced, to sort of so consumers would really know what has gone into those products. I wanted to move quickly on to another subject. Tom Field, one of our contributors who's also here with us today, of UV Tech Hygienics, an entrepreneur, talks about how companies can really understand how green their operations could be. Tom, do you want to say a few words about your question? Oh, is he still here?
Yeah. Hi, Beverley. Thank you.
Hi, thank you.
I think from my side of things, from an entrepreneur, everything just comes down to incentive. When you're setting up a new entity, what are those big drivers in actually making that entity built around green foundations? You know, typically in that hunt of problem solving and solutionizing of creating a new entity, is that necessarily built with the greenest of intentions, or are you just solving an everyday problem? And how can we fit that green thinking into entrepreneurism was what I wanted to cover. But that isn't just in entrepreneurship, that's in intrapreneurship within organizations as well, and having the mechanisms internally to look at processes, look at operations, and question, are there the greenest outcomes which are coming out of here? And it's a question of how much do businesses know how green they could be? Is that understanding of green capacity truly met, or is there further education and initiatives that need to be in place to drive, you know, entrepreneurship models which produce greener outcomes, versus also how do we celebrate that to drive the future green entrepreneurs of tomorrow and giving them a platform to have a voice and share their green ideas. So yeah, those are some of the musings running around my head.
Thanks so very much. Does anybody want to comment on that? Vicky or Steve, perhaps any thoughts on that? No, Steve, you're muted, by the way.
No, I can only agree that I think that one of the things that's come out, I think Jonathan said this, that it's the sort of next generation who are finding sort of ways of doing things differently. And again, in the couple of examples I gave at the end, off the scale is that that's slightly older, but of course in the sort of the other case, the clean kilo, you know, that they're young people, they want a better future, and they've every right to expect it. Again, as Jonathan also said, you know, we've made a right mess of the world, but it's not too late, but we've got to act with great urgency. So yeah, and of course change is required everywhere, and of course we do need sort of that entrepreneurial aspect.
Thank you so much, Steve. All right, well, we're pretty much...
Sorry, yeah, you asked me to say something. Yeah, yes, apologies, because I thought Steve was going to come out first. I mean, the truth is that there is, you know, quite a lot of our new entrepreneurs are in the digital area. And of course, there is a very close link between digital and the transformation, if you like, and climate change transformation. And of course, again, looking at what the EU is doing, they are linking the two very closely together, and saying that the way we're going to be achieving some of that transition is going to be through doing everything in a more digital way. So, and I think we need to start thinking about green, not particular green industries. I was quite aware of the numbers, or at least I had forgotten the numbers. I was not quite aware of the numbers, really what I'm going to say, of the drop in green jobs. But actually anything that facilitates greener production is a green job. So just identifying some jobs as green and some as non-green is probably not the right thing to be doing.
Oh, thanks very much, Vicky. Right, well, I think we really are pretty much out of time. I'm conscious that there's one of our fellow co-authors, Richard Haynes, who hasn't made a contribution. Richard, your chapter looks at modern methods of construction. Do you want to just say a very few words on that subject, and then I think we might have to bring proceedings to a close.
Yeah, firstly, just want to say, Beverley, Stephen, thank you very much for putting the book together, and really looking forward to reading all the other contributions. Just from an innovation perspective, my role at the time at WHG Housing was innovation manager, and one of the things that strikes me that gets in the way of innovation is our ability to properly understand the problem and get a real grasp and handle on what is it we're trying to tackle and fix. So we're quite specific about that. But the other problem as well, I was looking at the comments by Tom Ragg about some of the things that can get in the way of innovation and creativity. And I think raises an interesting point about intellectual property. Lawrence Lessig, that's the head of law at Harvard, has done quite a lot of work on how intellectual property protection actually slows down innovation. It doesn't help to accelerate it or push it forward. So I think we've got lots of challenges and barriers. Certainly children, young people are a big part of, being part of, addressing those challenges. Look forward to the action that comes forward from the book, and maybe the sequel as well. I think the interesting points about behaviours, which I think is probably the biggest challenge ahead. And one of the revelations in writing the book that I learned about through looking at our own advanced modular construction housing was that we can develop the technologies. So, for example, some of the device manufacturers through Energy Systems Catapult said to me that, we've designed this more efficient technology, but people are leaving the windows open and turning the thermostat up higher. So it doesn't actually solve the original problem that we set out to address. So I think that point Vicky raised right at the very beginning about behaviour is really important. Thank you, Beverley.
Thank you to everybody who's joined us today. We've had a fantastic turnout. I'm really grateful to you. Sorry I've only managed to get to a handful of questions. It's been brilliant to see such a wide spread of people here from all different parts of the country and all different backgrounds and professions. To Bite Size Books, our publishers, many thanks for your support. We are looking to produce another book ahead of COP26 on green manufacturing. So hopefully we'll be able to repeat this exercise in a few months' time or something like it. And a very, very special thanks to our panelists, to Vicky. Vicky, thanks so much for everything you do for us at Birmingham City University. To Jonathan Porritt, who's sadly dropped off the call, but a fantastically stimulating series of thoughts there. Hopi, thank you so much for stepping in, and Vanessa, thanks for joining us too. Jack, really grateful to you for joining us today when you're not feeling so well, and as ever for the lucidity and clarity of your contribution. And to my long-suffering colleague Steve McCabe, many thanks. Great working with you, Steve, and look forward to the next book. Thank you to everybody. It's been a really stimulating session. Sorry again, I didn't get to all the questions, but great to see you all. Really appreciate it, and have a great day. Enjoy the weekend. Take care, everybody.
Thank you all, and thank you, Beverley.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.